The dull hum of the air conditioner blended with the rhythmic tapping of a keyboard in the sterile office of Donovan and Reed Collections. Michael Donovan, a man whose very name commanded respect and fear in the world of debt collection, was silhouetted against the glow of his computer screen. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the list of names and figures before him. The cursor stopped at one name: Sarah Jennings. Michael's phone call to Sarah was as cold as the iced coffee that sat untouched on his desk. "Ms. Jennings, this is Michael Donovan from Donovan and Reed. Your account has been flagged for immediate resolution. I need to remind you that failure to address this matter will result in further action." The voice that answered was weary, tinged with a stress that Michael had grown all too familiar with. "Please, Mr. Donovan, I'm begging for a bit more time. My daughter, she's been sick and—" But Michael cut her off with practiced ease. "I'm afraid personal circumstances cannot alter the facts of your debt. You have until the end of the week." He ended the call, the finality of his tone echoing in the now silent office. The day wore on with more calls, more demands, and the same unyielding script. As the sun began to set, painting the city in hues of orange and purple, Michael stood outside a rundown apartment building, the address of which matched the one on Sarah Jennings' file. He rang the bell, and the door opened to reveal the reality of her life. A small, cluttered space that spoke of hard times and harder work. Toys were scattered across the floor, and a stack of bills lay on a small kitchen table, one marked with a red "overdue." Before Michael could speak, a burst of laughter heralded the arrival of a young girl with bright eyes and a mess of curls. "Are you Mommy's friend from work?" she asked innocently, holding out a crayon drawing. Michael was taken aback, the unexpected innocence of the child piercing the armor he wore daily. "No, He paused, the words catching in his throat. "Emma, honey, go finish your homework," Sarah interjected quickly, her eyes darting nervously between her daughter and the debt collector. Emma scampered away, leaving behind the drawing of a happy family in her wake. For a moment, Michael was caught in the vivid colors, a stark contrast to the grayscale of his existence. He handed Sarah the final notice without a word, the act feeling heavier than ever before. Back in his apartment, Michael's dinner sat cold as he mulled over the day's events. The crayon drawing lay on the table, a beacon of color in his monochromatic world. It was just a piece of paper, but it felt like a weight pressing down on him, challenging him. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as if it held answers. The lives behind the debts he collected had always been abstract, just numbers on a page. But now, the reality of those lives invaded his thoughts, unbidden and unwelcome. For the first time, the thought crept into Michael's mind. What if there was more to his world than the relentless pursuit of debt? What if he could be more than the sum of his collections? The night grew deep, and the questions loomed larger, marking the beginning of a change he never saw coming. Michael arrived early at the Donovan and Reed offices the next morning, the sky still a pre-dawn gray. He bypassed the empty cubicles and went straight to his desk, where the portfolio case given to him by his boss, Mr. Henderson, waited. It contained the files of a high-profile corporate debtor, a potential milestone in his career with a hefty bonus in tow. Michael opened the case and tried to focus on the figures and legal jargon, but his mind kept wandering back to Sarah Jennings and her daughter, Emma. His usual methodical approach to his work felt disrupted, the numbers blurring before his eyes as he recalled Emma's innocent laughter and the stark desperation in Sarah's eyes. Michael shook his head, trying to dispel the images. "Focus," he muttered to himself, but the numbers continued to dance meaninglessly on the page. Later that evening, Michael sought solace at the Rusty Tap, a dimly lit bar where the bartender, a middle-aged man named Joe, recognized his regulars by their drink of choice rather than their faces. Michael sat at the far end of the bar, nursing a glass of whiskey that burned less than the turmoil brewing within him. The bar was a refuge from the constant calls and messages that seemed to demand his attention. a place where he could be anonymous and unburdened by the lives he impacted daily. But tonight, even the whiskey couldn't wash away the thoughts of Sarah and Emma. His phone vibrated incessantly in his pocket, a relentless reminder of the life he was trying to escape, if only for a moment. With a sigh, Michael turned it off. He didn't want to hear the pleas, the excuses, or the cries for mercy anymore. He wanted the world and its problems to disappear. The night crept on, and the bar slowly emptied until Michael was left alone with his thoughts. The weight of the day pressed down on him, and he realized that the simplicity of his life before meeting Sarah was something he might never be able to return to. As he stumbled into his apartment, the darkness was a relief. But then he noticed something peculiar, an envelope placed precisely in the center of his doormat. It was small, nondescript, and yet it seemed to emanate a strange energy. He picked it up with a sense of foreboding, opening it to find a single piece of paper inside. It was a note from Emma, the loops and swirls of her handwriting, spelling out a message of gratitude for being kind to her mother. The words were like a lifeline thrown into the churning sea of his conscience, pulling him towards an inevitable decision. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He couldn't ignore the impact his actions had on people's lives. Michael sat at his dining table, the note in his hands, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his actions. The note from Emma was more than a thank you. It was a call to adventure, a plea for him to be the man that Emma mistakenly believed he was. It was time for Michael to decide whether to continue down the path he had been on for so long, or to forge a new one, guided by the compassion he had long buried beneath the facade of the relentless debt collector. The morning light spilled across the orderly array of cubicles at Donovan Knapp Reed Collections, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out like fingers, beckoning Michael Donovan back to the reality of his work. He paused at the entrance, taking a deep breath before stepping into the fray of ringing phones and hushed negotiations. Today, the office felt like a battleground between his old life and the new path he was considering. Joan, a colleague known for her gentle demeanor, caught Michael's eyes over the partition. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice low and sympathetic. She had been with the company long enough to understand the toll the job could take on one's conscience. Michael nodded, unsure how much to reveal. Instead of heading straight to his desk, Michael detoured to the break room, where he knew he could find a moment of peace. Over a cup of stale coffee, he unfolded Emma's note and read it again. Joan followed, her presence a silent question. With a sigh, Michael decided to confide in her, sharing his encounter with Sarah and Emma, and the disquiet that had settled in his chest ever since. "I can't shake the feeling that what we do here, it's not right," Michael confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Joan listened, her expression thoughtful, and then she nodded. "You're not alone in that," she affirmed. "There are a few of us here who feel the same. We just don't know what to do about it." The rest of the day found Michael navigating his job with a heightened awareness. When he spoke to debtors on the phone, he found himself listening more and dictating less. He set up a payment plan for Mr. Franklin, a retired veteran, on a fixed income, and he advised a young couple, the Martins, on how to consolidate their debt to avoid the crippling interest rates. Word of Michael's softened approach spread discreetly through the office. Linda, the administrative assistant who had always maintained a professional distance from the enforcers, approached Michael at the end of the day. "I heard about what you did for Mr. Franklin," she said, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you." It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. Yet not everyone was pleased with the change in Michael. Rick, a co-worker who prided himself on his high collection rates, cornered Michael by the water cooler. "You're playing a dangerous game, Donovan," he warned. "Compassion doesn't collect checks." The day drew to a close with Michael feeling like he was standing at a crossroads. As he organized his desk, Mr. Henderson called him into his office. The air was thick with unspoken tension as Michael took a seat across from his boss. "I've been hearing stories, Michael," Mr. Henderson began, his tone measured but stern. stories that don't align with the reputation you've built. Care to explain? Michael met his boss's gaze, his decision clear in his mind. I'm not sure I can continue doing things the way I've been doing them, he admitted. Not after seeing the impact it has on people's lives. Mr. Henderson leaned back in his chair, considering Michael with a calculating eye. I admire your newfound morality, but let me remind you, morality doesn't keep the lights on, he said coolly. Think about that before you make any rash decisions. Michael sat rigid in the leather chair of Mr. Henderson's office, a file brimming with irregularities clutched in his hands. The walls, adorned with accolades and degrees, seemed to close in on him. Mr. Henderson, his fingers steepled, watched Michael with an eagle's gaze from across the mahogany desk. I've found discrepancies in our interest calculations, Michael began, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his chest, particularly with Sarah Jennings's account. He laid the file open, pointing to the figures that didn't add up, his finger steady despite the tremor he felt inside. Mr. Henderson leaned forward, his eyes scanning the document briefly before returning to Michael's face, unimpressed. An oversight, he dismissed with a wave of his hand. It happens. We're in the business of profit, Donovan, not charity. Michael's jaw clenched at the casual dismissal of his concerns. These oversights are ruining lives, he countered, feeling a surge of defiance. We have a responsibility. A responsibility to our shareholders, Michael, Mr. Henderson cut him off, to our bottom line. Your job is to collect, not to question. The conversation continued, a verbal chess match where every move Michael made was countered by Mr. Henderson's unwavering focus on company policy. Michael left the office feeling isolated and disillusioned, his belief in the system he had been a part of for so long shattered. The day progressed with an undercurrent of tension. Michael found himself on the outside of conversations, his colleagues casting wary glances in his direction. Rick's words from the day before echoed in his mind. Compassion doesn't collect checks. The reality of his situation was becoming increasingly clear, and with it, a sense of exclusion from the world he had known. Lunchtime found Michael alone in the park, across from the office building, sitting on a bench with the city's sounds swirling around him. The file on Sarah Jennings lay open on his lap, a beacon of the decision he was grappling with. A young mother played with her child in the grass nearby, their laughter a bitter reminder of the stakes at hand. As the afternoon waned, Michael steeled himself for another meeting with Mr. Henderson. This time he came armed not just with discrepancies, but with a demand for transparency and a call for ethical reform within the company. The meeting was brief. Mr. Henderson's ultimatum was clear: fall in line or find a new line of work. Back at his desk, Michael sat in a daze. The office buzzed around him, a hive of activity that he felt disconnected from. He thought of Sarah and Emma, of Mr. Franklin, of the young couple with their entire future ahead of them. The weight of the truth he held was suffocating. As the office emptied and the sky outside turned to dusk, a deep resolve settled over Michael. He packed his personal belongings into a small box, the mementos of his career feeling strangely foreign in his hands. With a last look around the office that had been his world, he switched off his computer and walked out, the file on Sarah Jennings tucked under his arm. Michael Donovan left Donovan and Reed Collections with the weight of his decision pressing down on him, but also with a newfound sense of freedom. It was the end of one chapter, but the beginning of something entirely new. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face it head on. The next morning, Michael's departure from Donovan and Reed Collections was the hushed talk of the office. He had walked out with a sense of finality, leaving behind a career built on relentless pursuit for something more meaningful yet undefined. In the solitude of his apartment, Michael's former life seemed like a distant echo. The emptiness was cavernous without the constant ring of phones and the sharp clack of keyboards. He poured himself a coffee, the steam rising like the uncertainty that clouded his thoughts. He dialed Joan's number, the phone trembling slightly in his grasp. "I've left the firm," he confessed when she answered, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause, and then Joan's voice, steady and calm, filled the void. "What will you do now?" she asked. "I'm not sure," Michael replied, gazing out the window at the city awakening. "But I can't go on as I was, not after everything I've seen." With Joan's encouragement, Michael began to draft a plan. He would use his insider knowledge to fight against the predatory practices he had once enforced. The dining table, once a place for silent meals, became a makeshift command center littered with legal pads and case files. As Michael delved into the labyrinth of laws and statutes, a network of support began to form. Joan connected him with others from the office who shared his concerns, and together they started to document the systemic issues within the debt collection industry. One evening, amidst the sea of paperwork, Michael received a call from an unknown number. It was Linda, the administrative assistant from Donovan and Reed. "I have something you should see," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. They met at a quiet cafe, the murmur of hushed conversations enveloping them. Linda slid a USB drive across the table. "It's all there, the inflated rates, the falsified charges. I couldn't just sit back and watch." Michael grasped the drive, the weight of it far exceeding its physical size. It was the key to unlocking the change he sought, but it was also a beacon of risk. He could feel the precipice before him, the divide between the safety of ignorance and the peril of truth. Armed with the evidence, Michael and his small band of allies convened in Joan's living room, their faces illuminated by the glow of a laptop as they pored over the files. The room was thick with determination, and the collective resolve to make things right. As they strategized, Michael couldn't help but think of Sarah Jennings and her daughter Emma. They were the faces of the fight he was preparing to wage, the human cost of a system that had lost its way. He had gone from enforcer to protector, and there was no turning back. The clock ticked past midnight, and the group disbanded with a promise to reconvene. Michael lay awake in bed, the night's discussions replaying in his mind. He knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of hope. Michael Donovan was no longer a debt collector. He was an advocate, a champion for the voiceless, and he was just getting started. The crisp morning air was a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere Michael Donovan had left behind at the office. He clutched the USB drive close as he made his way to the high-rise that housed Donovan and Reed collections. Today, he would confront the machinery he had once been a part of with irrefutable evidence of its malpractices. Inside the boardroom, the tension was palpable. Mr. Henderson presided at the head of the table, his eyes icy as Michael entered. Flanked by the company's legal team, Michael presented the contents of the USB drive, the air thick with anticipation as the projected figures laid bare the unethical inflation of debts. "Explain this," Michael demanded, his voice echoing in the hushed room. The legal team shuffled papers, their faces a mix of concern and disbelief as they were confronted with the reality of their own complicity. Mr. Henderson remained silent, his expression unreadable. The meeting reached a crescendo of arguments and denials, with Michael countering each evasion with hard evidence. The confrontation left him drained, but resolute. It was clear that Donovan and Reed would not change their ways willingly. Returning to his apartment, Michael's phone rang with an unknown number. It was Sarah Jennings, her voice quivering with a cocktail of fear and relief. "The debt collection calls have stopped," she said. "I don't know how or why, but thank you, Mr. Donovan, thank you." Michael's heart clenched. He hadn't expected his actions to yield results so soon, and he grappled with the urge to tell her everything. Instead, he simply assured her to take care of Emma and herself, a promise hanging in the air that he would continue to fight. The victory was short-lived. Later that day, a cease and desist letter arrived, bearing the weight of legal threats from Donovan and Reed. Michael's former allies within the company grew silent, distancing themselves out of fear of retribution. In the wake of the letter, a revelation pierced the fog of war. An anonymous source within the company leaked documents to Michael, revealing a systematic targeting of vulnerable debtors. The scope was larger than he had imagined. It was not just about numbers, but about lives systematically upended for profit. The weight of the fight bore down on Michael, the solitary nature of his quest crystallizing in his mind. He pored over the new documents, the night stretching thin around him. In those quiet hours, the lines between enemy and ally blurred. His mission was clear, but the path was lined with shadows. A knock at his door jolted Michael from his work. He opened it to find Joan, her eyes fierce with resolve. "I'm with you," she declared. "We started this together, and I'm not backing down now." The tipping point had come. With Joan's reaffirmed support and the leaked documents in hand, Michael prepared for the next phase of his battle. The night sky began to pale to dawn, and as the first light of day crept into the room, so too did a renewed sense of purpose. Michael Donovan had been a collector of debts. Now he would be a collector of truths, no matter the cost. The battle lines were drawn, and he was ready to stand firm. In the aftermath of his confrontation with Donovan and Reed Collections, the solitude of Michael Donovan's apartment felt more like a fortress of solitude than a home. The cease and desist letter lay on his table, a tangible representation of the daunting legal battle ahead. It was a battle he was prepared to fight, but not one he was guaranteed to win. The once steady flow of information and camaraderie from his allies within the firm had trickled to a stop, leaving Michael to face the Goliath alone. His phone, once a lifeline to those who supported his cause, now sat silent. The isolation was suffocating, and doubts began to creep into the edges of his resolve. As he sat staring at the city skyline, a symbol of the corporate might he was challenging, a profound sense of defeat settled over him. The enormity of what he was trying to accomplish felt overwhelming, and for the first time since he had embarked on this path, Michael considered giving up. The thought was a bitter pill to swallow, and it left a hollow feeling in his chest. The next morning, Michael found himself at the local park, watching the world go by. The sound of children's laughter rang out, a stark contrast to the silence of his current world. He watched a father hoist his daughter onto his shoulders, and the sight pricked at the raw edges of his conscience. Lost in thought, Michael barely noticed the approach of an elderly man until he was addressed by name. "Mr. Donovan?" The voice belonged to Mr. Franklin, the retired veteran he had helped months before. The old man's eyes were kind, his hand extended in gratitude. "I heard about your fight," he said. "You did right by me, and I want you to know. It made a difference." Their conversation was a balm to Michael's weary soul. Mr. Franklin's words were a pep talk that reignited the dying embers of Michael's determination. By the time they parted ways, Michael's shoulders were squared, and the defeat that had threatened to engulf him had receded. Buoyed by Mr. Franklin's encouragement, Michael returned to his apartment with a renewed purpose. He pored over the documents once more, his mind whirring with strategies and plans. He reached out to community organizations and local media, his message clear. He would not be intimidated into silence. The fight against Donovan and Reed's predatory practices would continue. In the days that followed, Michael's story began to gain traction. A local journalist took interest, and soon his apartment was transformed into a makeshift interview set. The story of a debt collector turned defender of the indebted captivated the public's attention. As he addressed the camera, Mikhail felt the phenol remnants of his old self slip away. He was no longer Mikhail Donovan, the ruthless debt collector. He was Mikhail Donovan, the advocate, the fighter, the man who had risen from the depths of his despair to wield the sword of truth against injustice. As the interview concluded, Michael felt a sense of accomplishment he had never experienced in his former career. He had seized the sword, and with it, he was carving out a path not just for himself, but for all those who had been voiceless against the might of debt collectors. The battle was far from over, but Michael Donovan was ready to lead the charge. Michael Donovan's newfound sense of purpose was infectious, spreading through the veins of the city as the local news aired his story. The man who once hunted down debtors with unyielding tenacity was now their champion. His apartment, once a place of silent reflection, buzzed with the energy of a man on a mission. However, the road to redemption was paved with more obstacles than Michael had anticipated. The public support was a powerful force, but it couldn't shield him from the legal storm that Donovan and Reed Collections unleashed upon him. The firm's retaliation was swift and merciless, a lawsuit that sought not only to silence Michael, but to obliterate his credibility entirely. Facing the lawsuit, Michael felt the cold touch of fear he'd known as a collector. Only this time, it was directed inward. The threat of financial ruin loomed over him, a specter more daunting than any debtor he had ever confronted. He pondered the irony of it all. He might soon find himself on the other side of a collections notice. Yet, amid the legal skirmishes and sleepless nights, an unexpected ally emerged. Sarah Jennings, the single mother whose plight had first pricked his conscience, stepped forward. She organized a community fundraiser to help with Michael's legal fees, her voice joining the chorus of support that had begun to rally around him. As Michael walked into the courthouse, the weight of his past actions and their consequences bore down upon him. He could feel the eyes of the city upon him, some skeptical, others hopeful. He was not just fighting for himself, but for every debtor who had felt the crushing weight of an unjust system. The court battle was grueling. Donovan and Breed's attorneys were relentless, painting Michael as a disgruntled former employee on a vendetta. But as the trial progressed, it became apparent that there was more at stake than Michael's reputation. It was a battle for the soul of the debt collection industry itself. In the courtroom's gallery, Michael spotted faces from his past, debtors whose lives he had once upended. Their presence was both a comfort and a reminder of the stakes. He took the stand, his testimony a raw and unvarnished account of the collection industry's darkest corners. The trial reached its climax when Linda, the administrative assistant from Donovan and Breed, came forward with a decisive piece of evidence. It was a recording of a meeting where company executives outlined their strategy to exploit vulnerable debtors. The courtroom fell silent as the recording played, the voices of Michael's former employers condemning themselves. In the end, the judge ruled in Michael's favor, a verdict that echoed beyond the courtroom and into the lives of those who had suffered at the hands of Donovan and Breed Collections. The company was ordered to pay a substantial settlement and to reform its collection practices. As Michael stepped out of the courthouse, he felt the enormity of what he had achieved. The battle had been hard fought, and the victory was as unexpected as it was sweet. He had set out to make amends for his past, and in doing so, he had changed the future for countless others. The sun was setting as Michael walked through the city streets, the fading light casting long shadows behind him. He had faced ultimate defeat and emerged victorious, a man redeemed. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Michael Donovan was no longer a man haunted by his past. He was a man who had conquered it. In the wake of his victory, the city seemed to Michael Donovan as if it had undergone a transformation. The buildings cast longer, less ominous shadows, and the people he passed on the street no longer seemed like potential debtors or numbers to be collected. They were individuals, each with their own story, and Michael had become a part of their narrative, a force for good. Michael's story had resonated with the city, and his phone was now a conduit for messages of gratitude and support, not the desperate pleas of debtors. At a local cafe, a woman recognized him and approached. "You don't know me, Mr. Donovan, but you saved my family's home," she said, her eyes welling with tears. "Thank you doesn't even begin to cover it." These encounters became Michael's new normal. He took each thank you as both a balm for his past deeds and as a reminder of his new responsibilities. He had become an accidental hero, a role he never anticipated, but was now determined to embody. In the spirit of his transformation, Michael had begun to volunteer at a financial advocacy center. Here, He used his insider knowledge to help those struggling with debt navigate the complex and often predatory landscape of personal finance. He led workshops and seminars, his words a mixture of practical advice and personal atonement. One day, as he was setting up for a workshop, Joan walked in. She had left Donovan at Reed Collections too, inspired by Michael's courage. Together, they were a formidable team, using their combined experience to effect change. "We're making a real difference, Michael," Joan said, her hand resting on his arm. "You started this." The workshop was filled with attendees, each face a testament to the impact of Michael's new mission. He began to speak, his voice clear and confident. "Financial freedom is not just about numbers," he told them. "It's about dignity, about control over your life, about justice." As he spoke, Michael could feel the final vestiges of his old self slipping away. The ruthless debt collector was no more. In his place stood an educator, an advocate, and a friend. The workshop ended with applause, not for Michael Donovan, the man, but for the message of hope and empowerment he had brought them. The sun was low in the sky when Michael left the center, the day's work a gratifying weight on his shoulders. He walked through the park where he had once contemplated surrender, where Mr. Franklin had given him the strength to continue. Children played in the distance, their joyous shouts a counterpoint to the quiet satisfaction that filled him. He paused by a pond, watching the reflection of the clouds in the water, the surface rippling with the breeze. Here, in this place of reflection, Michael allowed himself to finally let go of the burden of who he had been. He was reborn, not through a grand gesture or a dramatic event, but through countless small acts of kindness and courage. As he walked home, Michael Donovan knew that the fight against debt and despair would continue. But he also knew that he would not face it alone, and that each step forward was a step toward a future filled with hope. The debt collector had become a collector of hope, and that was a legacy that would endure.